Hello and welcome to the third episode of Season 2 of the God in Film podcast, where a Christian and an atheist dive into the best that cinema has to offer and see if we can find any elements that have parallels with the Gospel or any other Bible stories. I'm media coordinator and guy your mother warned you about, Giles Goff.
And I'm filmmaker and leprechaun in training, Phil Coleman.
And during this time of historical turning point, we'll be trying to stave off the desire to scream obscenities at presidential debates by strapping our film geek glocks on to analyse Training Day, the 2001 cop drama starring Denzel Washington and Ethan Hawke, directed by Antoine Fuqua. Now, it's important to note that whilst our podcast is clean, this film is most distinctly not, so please be advised. We'll be looking at the issues of integrity, temptation, and the difference between degree and category. Phil, what did you think of this film?
It's just so bloody intense. It's got a little bit of a reprieve just at the start. And I say the word reprieve, but it's not even gotten into it yet. and that's the calmest bloody bit of the film, you know. And you've got then Denzel Washington just sort of swans in, just kind of I'm gonna make your day really hard. You know, it's just not that he says it in that kind of way, but he says a lot more swear words. It was just one of those films that it grabs you and it does not let go, even until the last few minutes. It's brilliant. I really enjoyed it.
I love this film. My gosh, I love this film. I was just the right age when this film came out. It was 2001. I was 18 and I had no idea what to expect. But I came out of it feeling so much cooler just by watching it. You know, the way Alonso kind of walks around all in black and leather and the rest of it, gets into the Monte Carlo car. I came out of Cineworld in Llandudno Junction with my black leather jacket on, walking like a screaming badass to my metro.
I could just imagine you walking out. It's kind of yes, you don't want to mess with me. or words to that effect.
For legal reasons, listeners, I have never had a North Walian accent.
No, I know, but because I know you're from Wales, that's just how I imagine you in my head for some weird reason. I don't know why.
I mean, if anything, I think Training Day is due for a Welsh remake. Now listen.
Training Day.
Do you want to go to jail or do you want to go home?
I suggest you smoke this crack pipe now, otherwise it's going to go very badly for you. I don't know why he's from South Wales now, but still, you know.
It's okay, that is okay. Believe it or not, this was one of the first DVDs I ever bought. I think it was the first one I ever bought from a shop. And I had the soundtrack, and the soundtrack is tailor-made for me. It just pops, you know. There's little inserts from the from the film in it that have stuck in my head as a result, you know. Just fantastic. Anyway, I could enthuse about this all day, but without further ado, let's go on to Phil's Facts.
La la! Okay, so Training Day is a 2001 American crime thriller film directed by Antoine Fuqua and written by David Ayer, who is a lot more famous now than he was then.
Yeah, definitely.
Denzel Washington and Ethan Hawke star as two LAPD narcotics officers over a 12-hour period in the gang-ridden neighborhoods of Westlake, Echo Park, and South Central in Los Angeles. During the scene when Jake plays cards with the Latino gangsters, director Antoine Fuqua gave certain instructions to the actors playing the gangsters without telling Ethan Hawke, and this was done to further confuse him and add that little bit of tension to the scene as well. Obviously, he doesn't know why he's playing cards with them. He's had a pretty rough day. Yeah. And, but I thought it was quite interesting that, that kind of directorial technique.
Yeah, the way you want to create a sort of genuine disconnect between the actors, you know?
Yeah.
It's really interesting, that.
T. Rogers, the founder of the Black Pea Stones Bloods in Baldwin Village, aka the Jungles, in Los Angeles, was on set for all of the filming in his neighborhood and allowed the producer to use his neighborhood in exchange for casting gang members.
Well, first of all, I'm not even a little bit surprised because it has that feel to it. That most iconic scene towards the end of the film where he's saying, King Kong ain't got nothing on me, they build jails because of me. Do you see the person standing in front of him after Ethan Hawke has left?
He looks mean.
It's Terry Crews.
Oh, yeah, of course it's Terry Crews. Yeah. He's the, I looked this up, he's the pigeon flipper.
Yeah,
the guy, he's just there clapping like that. That's Terry Crews as well. That's just there,
just one of the most delightful things that obviously he wasn't famous in the same way 19 years ago, and now you see him and it's fantastic, you know.
I see him in AGT all the time when I watch it with Elise.
Yeah.
And he's like the nicest person ever to live. You know
Absolutely.
What I mean?
The other thing is, back in 2001, Eva Mendes, who plays Alonzo's wife, she wasn't famous at the time either. You know, it was.
I was surprised to see her in it because she wasn't like a main role in it or anything like that.
Yeah.
She wasn't advertised for a main role in it. Nowadays, Eva Mendes is like more of a Hollywood household name, isn't it? So.
Exactly. Anyway, what else have you got for me?
So Tobey Maguire was seriously considered for the part of Officer Jake Hoyt. He even followed undercover narcotics officers in Los Angeles for 2 months and gained weight for the role. He was dropped when Ethan Hawke, Fuqua's first choice, was finally available for the shooting schedule. Now, I don't have official confirmation that Ethan Hawke was Fuqua's first choice. Tobey was definitely in the running, so stands to reason more than likely is true.
When these kind of rumours come along, there's so many different rumours like this which are of different levels of credibility to them. It could be that you had a conversation over the phone. It could be that the script went to your agent, or it could be that you met with the producer and the directors and all the rest of it, and then the contract fell through due to scheduling. Do you know one of the things they have in Hollywood with films is they negotiate priority. So for example, the best example would be Mission Impossible, the one with Henry Cavill, where he has the moustache.
Yeah.
And because that movie had the priority, they could. That's why they didn't shave the moustache off for the reshoots.
And that's why he had that god awful, very famously god awful.
Yeah.
Moustache CGI'd out.
One thing I can definitely say is they definitely made the right choice with Ethan Hawke.
Absolutely just owns that role.
He's a wonderful actor. What else have you got for me?
When the movie came out, many viewers and critics were sceptical of the scenes where Jake Hoyt smokes marijuana laced with PCP. And Alonzo's explanation of how a cop who didn't take drugs offered to him on the street would be ID'd as police and murdered. David Ayer responded in an interview by holding up a highlighted section of the LAPD's rules and regulations, and it stated that officers were allowed to use narcotics in very specific undercover situations and hewed closely to what Alonzo told Jake. So if they're undercover, it has to be absolutely necessary. For them to not break cover and actually sort of be able to catch the person they're tailing. But like, if you're just doing it just because you just like weed, then you know what I mean. That's just illegal. So you shouldn't be doing that. The license plate on Alonzo's car is ORP 967, which is a nod to Officer Rafael Perez, the disgraced LAPD officer who was born in 1967 and on whom the character of Alonzo was based.
Yes, we're going to get into that later. I was looking at the number plate and I couldn't quite twig. So that's fantastic.
I thought that was pretty interesting myself, actually.
Yeah.
This movie is unique in Academy Awards history in that it's the only time an African-American Denzel Washington won the Best Actor
An African-American Denzel Washington.
An African-American
as opposed to white Denzel Washington or Asian Denzel Washington.
I'm just reading it. I'm just reading it from how I've written it, and I've realised that I suggest that there are many Denzel Washingtons of different races.
I love the idea that there's like in the multiple universe theory, there are many Denzels, all of different races and creeds.
This is Hispanic Denzel.
Oh,
and
yes.
We've got Italian Denzel.
Welsh Denzel. Welsh Denzel. Like, Welsh Training Day. You and me, we could definitely do that. I'll be Alonzo. You can be Hoyt. It'll be fantastic.
Can we just take like the most iconic scenes from Training Day and just turn it into a short film called Welsh Training Day?
Yes, please.
Just set in Gairwen.
Driving around the tough streets of Llandudno.
Yes, please, thank you. So I'm going to start that one slightly differently.
Okay.
Yeah, unique in the Academy Awards history in that it's the only time an African-American man, Denzel Washington, won the Best Actor Oscar as directed by a fellow African-American man, Antoine Fuqua.
Love it.
Although, to be honest, what we were talking about is so much more interesting.
Yeah.
So the F word is used 211 times.
Is that all?
Can you imagine saying the F word just over and over 211 times? You'd have to put out a portion of your day.
I think you've never taught secondary. Where I think you find there are plenty of reasons to do so. You just have to fit it in when the kids aren't around, you know?
I mean, I wouldn't mind, mate, but I've worked in hospitality all my life. There is plenty of opportunities to say that word. So I've only got a couple more anyway.
Okay.
So the original ending had Alonzo getting away with his crimes, but Denzel Washington insisted that it be amended so he gets his comeuppance. Denzel is a firm Christian, and the first thing he wrote on his script was, "The wages of sin is death."
But the gift of God
And he was quoted as saying,
life.
and he said, in order for me to justify him living in the worst way, he has to die in the worst way. That's that's a quote from Denzel Washington when it came to playing the character of Alonzo.
Wow, that's wicked.
I mean, that makes perfect sense, really. And he does die in a pretty horrible way as well.
There's no way that character can survive.
He's sort of building up to a massive fall. He's juggling so many plates just to stay alive, and eventually they're all going to tumble.
It's the hubris that he's got. You know, he's a tragic figure as a result.
The absolute definition of in too deep, I think. Last one. Right before Hoyt gets into Alonzo's car following Roger's murder, spoilers. I like how I said spoilers after I said the spoiler. Alonzo can be heard on the phone saying, "Make sure the bathtub is clean." He's presumably speaking with Smiley about killing Jake at that point. Like, a little personal note for me, this is the last thing. There's something about the fact that he's asking for the bathtub to be clean. I feel like there's a small modicum of respect for Jake, despite the fact that he knows that he's a problem for him at this point.
No, the making the bathtub clean is just so that it's easier to rinse down, so you can get all the blood out, so that it doesn't get so you don't get anything caught on it.
That's destroyed my fantasy kind of element.
I'm really sorry.
Alonzo might be a little bit nicer than he is, but okay.
Like one of the things about this film was it taught us really nice ways to kill people with minimal amount of fuss and mess. And I've really taken that on in my life. I've taken that on board, you know.
Well, I mean, during all the ritual sacrifice you do, it does make sense. All those sheep, you know what I mean? They got a lot of hair, man.
A lot of sheep.
Oh God! He doesn't sacrifice sheep. He doesn't do that. I've known Giles for many years. It's fine. Anyway, that's my facts. Anyway,
fantastic, Phil. That was just what I needed today. That was brilliant.
I'm glad to bring some levity into your life.
Yeah. Now for our special guest, who I can't wait to introduce to you. He's an old friend. He's another Sandy Hill Camp alumni, just like Robbie was. And until further notice, he's going to be known as our US correspondent. I'll let him introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Sean Carlson. I live in Richmond, Virginia, in the States, but for 7 of the last 10 years, I lived in Los Angeles. And at one point even applied to be an LAPD officer. Fortunately, that didn't take, and now I work as a printer here in Virginia.
Sean, it is an absolute joy to have you on the podcast. I should say for listeners, last time Sean and I spoke, our conversation was cut short by the fact that my wife went into labour, so I'm confident that's nothing like that is going to happen this time. So without further ado, we'll get straight into the questions. So first of all, I was interested in every version of LA that you see on screen is always slightly different. Does this depiction of LA resemble your experience of LA at all?
My personal experience, not exactly. I mean, that wasn't exactly the neighborhood I was living in. That wasn't the world I was involved in by any means. But in terms of the realistic portrayal of Los Angeles, I thought it was actually very grounded. And I know for a fact that they shot on location in neighborhoods that had previously not been allowed access to. They made a really big effort to be as realistic in their portrayal of LA as possible. And I think they got much closer than most movies.
Obviously, this film deals heavily with police corruption and brutality. How well do you think it reflects that?
I think at the time that the movie came out, which is almost 20 years ago now, it seemed very flashy, very over the top, very, larger than life, based off of what I had experienced growing up in the suburbs of Virginia. And this was also, the movie came out right before the Rampart scandal really came to light. And there's still questions from that investigation that are unanswered today. I think looking back on it now, given the state of the world these days, it's a much more realistic portrayal than I think most people previously knew. Watching it again, I definitely came at it with a very different mindset of what I expect from a police officer, whereas previously it had been very positive. You look to them for safety and protection, and nowadays, I look at them with a sense of apprehension and a sense of caution and fear, honestly. I think that this was a really great portrayal of how Denzel Washington was able to play a cop using his power for personal gain. And it's a very, seems much truer to life.
We spent the summer looking at footage of police brutality to protesters all over the country. And I remember seeing on your particular feed that even in Richmond, which I always think of as being a comparatively quite a quiet town, you were still getting tear gas there, weren't you?
Yeah, I got tear gassed 30 minutes before the state mandated curfew with no warning from the police at a peaceful protest. It was enraging. It's hard to describe how angry I was. And I also had to remind myself that this happened to me once. I suffered this sort of injustice once. I'm a relatively young, straight white man in America. They don't really come after me or my demographic. And to feel that anger and that rage at what happened and realize that this is how people live every single day is insane. You mentioned that Richmond's a quiet town, and it is. It's a smaller city, compared to New York or LA or something like that. It was also the capital of the Confederacy.
Oh wow!
So when you want to talk some weird history, this is where the Civil War happened.
Wow!
The main street, like the main avenue that these protests were happening on, is called Monument Avenue. It is called Monument Avenue because it used to be littered with statues of predominantly Confederate heroes. Most of those statues have since been taken down, sometimes by the professionals, sometimes by the people.
Yeah, that's insane. I went through North Carolina very briefly, but just seeing the Confederate flag bumper stickers and things like that was still quite shocking,
It's a really interesting debate that's going on. I mean, it's in my mind, there is one correct side. I don't really see the logic behind the argument for the Confederate flag, but it's kind of a sign of the times that this conversation has become way more prominent and prevalent, and it's all just kind of coming to a head. Things in the States have been incredibly tense for the last 4 years, if not even a little more longer than that. But the last 6 months, 2020 in particular, has not been fun for anybody. But here in the States, it feels like it's just a pressure cooker waiting for that lid to blow off.
Absolutely. You mentioned something in passing there a moment ago about the Rampart scandal. Can you expand on that for us?
So the Rampart scandal is sort of what Training Day is based off of. Rampart is a district in LA. It covers a section of East LA, which when I lived there was a predominantly Hispanic or Latino neighborhood, and was known for, there were certainly sections of it that I was told not to go to unless I had a very clear purpose and usually an escort kind of thing. So I just didn't go there. But the Rampart scandal was a series of corrupt police officers in the crash unit, which was a reaction to gang violence and drugs. And what these officers were doing was shooting people unjustly and planting evidence to frame them for it. They were stealing cocaine or other drugs from evidence lockups and then selling them back to the streets. They were getting hired out by known gang members and gang affiliates to work private security off the clock. And then this whole scandal kind of came to a head when one officer in particular, Rafael Perez, which is the character, the person that Denzel Washington based Alonzo off of.
Right, yeah.
He came out, was caught, but then kind of spilled the beans to the higher ups about the extent of the corruption within the department and within his unit in particular. And it was a huge deal. Over 70 officers were implicated in criminal wrongdoings while operating as a police officer. But surprisingly, only 5 people were fired.
Of course.
It's very fitting. 12, I think 7 resigned.
Yeah.
Were asked to resign kind of thing. A few people got some suspensions. But out of 70 officers, all linked to heinous criminal wrongdoing, 5 were terminated. It's pretty indicative of the state of things here in the States right now.
Do you know what? It reminds me of that line in The Wire, to one of the later series, where it says, well, one of the cops is looking at the drug dealers and says, look, if they get something wrong, they get a beat down. If we get something wrong, we get pensioned off early. That's why we're going wrong,
Yep. I mean, and you look at the other movies, the police are the biggest gang in the States kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's how the crash unit operated in the Rampart district, was using their power and authority and the weight of the badge to bully and murder and beat and steal and do whatever they wanted.
Do you know, it had quite a massive impact because, again, this is one of those things where so much of culture and things I learned from rap music and then years later found out what it was, There's a mention in an exhibit track called about where he just mentions crooked ass cops in the Rampart district, So little things like that, you go, oh, okay, now I know what he was talking about now,
Yeah, and especially when you start thinking about the context of that style of music coming out, like the really like the 90s gangster rap. I mean, you're looking at the Rodney King beatings, the LA riots. Then you have this rampant corruption that's been running through LA for years and years and years and years, and only really just broke, at the turn of the millennium. You wonder why there weren't more issues before this, why the music wasn't even angrier.
So at this point, it feels like it's almost baked into the culture. I remember Tupac saying, you know, like, they got that guy's beating on tape and he's still waiting for his money. So it's that sense of, it doesn't seem to matter what you do, you're never getting justice, you know? Is there anything more you can tell us about Rafael Perez? Because from what I can tell, he's quite a fascinating character.
He seems very interesting. From all accounts, from what I've researched, he started off as a much like Jake Hoyt, like Ethan Hawke in the movie, where it's just, you know, I'm here to serve and protect and better my community. And then it wasn't until the war on drugs really took full effect that it became an us versus them mentality, that it became about numbers and about statistics and less about fixing the problem.
Yeah.
You know, they were treating the symptoms, not the disease, kind of thing. But Rafael Perez in particular, it's fascinating because, I mean, he has done time for some of his crimes. I think less than he deserves, given the nature of his. I mean, he stole almost $1 million worth of cocaine and put it back out on the streets, out of evidence lockers, and framed an officer who had shot another officer. I mean, it's a lot of like police on police violence in this case. You know, there's undercover cops shooting cops that are associated with gangs because they don't know better. You know, it was crazy. But Rafael Perez in particular, I know he's come out and tried to apologize and has very openly been like, there's not really anything I can say to atone or make up for what I've done. It's really up to the people to forgive me, which I think is true. There's nothing he can do to really make up for the culture that he instilled that kind of perpetuates to this day. Of that us versus them. I can't speak for the UK in terms of the war on drugs, but here in the States, it's less a war on drugs and more a war on poor. Just the way that's the systemic violence and racism that's built into those laws and regulations has just gotten worse and worse and more extreme to this day. And Rafael Perez was kind of at the center of it for LA for a while, watching the police chiefs cover it up or deny parts of the investigation or refuse to allow them to continue the investigation into certain areas to make them look better is inexcusable, to say the least.
Sean, that's some really fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. We really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Phil, that was Sean Carlson. What do you think?
I mean, first of all, I'm looking forward to going for a pint with that guy, because he seems like the right kind of person to talk about and be like, your country's messed up, mine is too. Let's have let's be mates. Let's get some shots, you know, something like that. You know, I mean, no, I feel like he's definitely the kind of person who's on the right side of history. It was nice to see an insight from somebody who's actually lived in the area for an extended period of time, has seen how those neighborhoods are, maybe not experienced the same kind of lifestyle, but you know, he's familiar with the history of it. He's seen them from an outside perspective, and I feel like that gives you enough context.
Definitely. But we talked quite a bit about the Rafael Perez character.
Yes.
And apparently he got mixed up in the murder of Biggie Smalls as well, of Notorious
really?
B.I.G. Yeah. I can't remember the exact specific details, but I think Voletta Wallace, Biggie's mum, filed like a wrongful death suit against the LAPD, and I think he was one of the people named in it. He was certainly involved in some way, shape or form. That was really shocking. Without further ado, let's get on to finding the faith in the film. So in today's section, what I wanted to talk about was the nature of temptation, because this whole film is essentially the story of one man being tempted towards corruption. Jake is being told to break the rules in order to progress in his career and make detective. Alonzo tells Jake at one point, give me 18 months and I'll give you a career. There's another interesting point later on where he makes a distinction between Jake and his other officer, saying, my guys are pretty good, but they're not leaders. They're clowns. You're a leader. He tries this sort of mixture of carrot and stick to get Jake to do what he wants to do, but it gets nowhere in the end. And it's fascinating because I think part of going into this film, you had Denzel Washington's star power and the fact that Denzel had a tendency to play good guys in it. So you go into a film with Denzel Washington assuming he's the good guy, and it's gradually gets sort of turned around on you, you know?
That's something that surprised me when I first watched this, is that Denzel Washington was playing a bad guy.
Exactly.
It's very apparent. You get the whiffs of it almost immediately when you meet his character in the film.
Yeah.
But again, it's completely against sort of like the archetype for Denzel and his usual choice in casting. Yeah, it just threw me off completely.
Absolutely.
Which is a good thing. I think, because I think that's how you're meant to feel.
If nothing else, Denzel is normally playing the protagonist, and in this, he's playing the antagonist. We kind of want him to get away with it, but we also kind of don't.
Yeah.
And so, like I say, this is a temptation story, and one of, if not the most clear example of a temptation story is the temptation of Christ, which is a short section that appears in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There's barely a mention of it in the Gospel of John. I'll give you the Matthew version first, which starts in chapter 4. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendour. "All this I will give you," he said, "if you will bow down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended him. Now, interestingly, this is much more complicated than the version in the Gospel of Mark. I should tell you, first of all, the Gospels have different reputations, if you like.
Okay.
There's a meme going round with the Gospel of Matthew that says, okay, for you to understand this is a real person, I'm going to give you his entire genealogy first. And then for the Gospel of Luke, it's like, for you to understand all this, I need to give you all the backstory first about how he was born. John is like, I want you to understand that God, this man was really person and he was really God. And Mark is like, all right, let's get on with it. You know?
Mark's like, right, God.
Yeah.
Nice. Good.
God, yes. To illustrate that, let me give you an example of how this story goes in the Gospel of Mark. The Spirit immediately drove Jesus out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild animals, and the angels were ministering to him. Boom. That's it.
I must admire Mark's succinct storytelling.
Yeah. Mark
prowess.
don't have time for this back and forth nonsense, you know?
Mark's just there like, I've got to be at markets in a bit. Wife needs goat. You know
I tell you what, Mark would have loved Twitter.
I like the fact that Mark is like, the Gospel of Mark is basically just like God Twitter. You know what I mean? 140 characters or less, man.
Oh, good Lord. The Gospels, if they were social media websites, that's fantastic.
I tell you what, mate, that's a meme in itself, and I see you at the forefront of it.
Yeah, so
mainly because I don't know the Bible.
That's the thing. Luke would be Facebook, so he'd go into everything and lots of different things.
Yeah.
Gospel of Matthew would be LinkedIn, so it's like, okay, there's Jesus, and he comes from this guy, who comes from this guy, and who's connected to that guy.
It's like playing the 7 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, but business.
Yeah. And then the Gospel of John would have to be Instagram. You know, it'd be lots of inspirational quotes over hazy sunsets and all the rest of it. You know,
I quite like the Gospel of Mark just being like, if you sin, you're bad. Nice one. Bye.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting, I was looking into this, and the Gospel of Mark is one of the earlier Gospels, and the other, Matthew and Luke, come later on. Apparently, the back and forth, the devil says something, then Jesus responds. The similarities between these two accounts suggest that they're both inspired by the same source document, and apparently it's sort of referred to as this theoretical, like, Q document. Nobody's got a name for it, but it's just, there must have been something written down about what Jesus said, and it would have been something a bit like this.
I like the fact that it's almost like Chinese whispers almost. I don't know if that's like the most politically correct term, but I can't think of a better way of putting it. Like, you know, it's just like, well, I remember it this way. Well, I remember it this way, and I'm going to write it this way.
Do you know what? Things like that make me feel more confident in the sources that there are these slight discrepancies, that it's not exactly the same, because if it was exactly the same things, you'd be a bit uncertain about it because it'd be too close to each other.
I think the element of human error does give it an air of authenticity that you wouldn't find elsewhere. So I see that.
I also learned that it wasn't literally out there for 40 days and 40 nights. Basically, 40 days and 40 nights was a phrase just to mean a long time. time, you know?
I mean, to be fair, he'd have been 100% dead by the end of that.
It's like saying, I'll be there in a minute, you know? as if they'd say, they must have been able to travel over incredible distances because he was able to get there in 1 minute, you know?
This is where we find out Jesus had a TARDIS.
Yeah.
Right?
I was really fascinated by that thing, the 40 days, that just means it was ages.
Yeah, I quite like that, actually. It seems like exactly the kind of thing that you would have said back in day, in this sort of older times, where it would have been, you know, like, oh, he was away for 40 days and 40 nights. So he was gone for like 4 days. Then.
Yeah, the idea that this 40 days and 40 nights keeps coming back up on,
like a long time ago, or in a time
ages.
hence past, or something.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, this is the what I'm thinking of is one of the precedents for a temptation story. Working on that basis, then Alonzo is the devil and Jake is Jesus. You know, he's constantly being taken to all these different places and say, if you just do what I say, if you just get me through this, then you'll be rewarded with a medal. You'll get the career. You'll people will think you're great, and all the rest of it. And it keeps coming up over and over and over again. And then obviously we got the same thing with Jesus. Now, I think this relates back to an even earlier temptation story, one right at the beginning of the Bible. Can you guess what it is?
No, actually, I can't. I pretend I don't know the Bible that well, but I did go to a Catholic school, so I should really know this.
Yeah.
But, you know, still.
So if we go all the way back to Genesis 3, verse 1 to 7, I'll read it out to you and see if it starts to sound familiar. Now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said to the woman, has God indeed said, you shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, we may eat the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, you shall not eat it, nor shall you touch it, lest you die. Then the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die, for God knows that in the day you eat it, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave it to her husband with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings.
Yeah, I can't Adam and Eve that I didn't get that one. Hey?
He's firing on all cylinders today, ladies and gentlemen.
Pew, pew, pew. Yeah.
So I was brought up in a church, or I became a Christian in a church where they sort of believed everything in the Bible was literally true. And whilst I have enough in my head to think that a lot of the things in there are literally true, like Jesus walking on water and all the rest of it, I'm less inclined to believe the creation story as it's written down, but I do think it illustrates a fairly obvious truism about human beings in that we're all flawed. We all give in to temptation at some form or other. And so what we have, by having this sort of the temptation of Jesus and the temptation of Adam put next to each other, what the gospel writers are doing is saying, look, this guy is something else. You know, Adam, the translation of Adam just means man or human. It's saying Adam had everything he could have ever wanted, and he was still tempted. Jesus was out in the desert. He had no food, no water, nowhere to sleep. He would have been in absolute desperation, and he still didn't give up. This guy is so much better than the rest of us, even on our best day.
Man was up the creek. Still was like, actually, you know what? No, not even thirsty, mate. Not even thirsty. You know what I mean? No, and you can't tempt me.
And the reason why this is interesting is that temptation is such a massive part of not just Christians' lives, but of everybody's lives, you know? We've all got temptation to deal with in some way, shape or form, and being able to see people who can overcome that temptation is really important for us, you know? Christianity is basically one long attempt to try to be like God, try to be like Jesus, and to keep failing and trying again and failing and trying again. So to be able to see stories where people don't give in to temptation is really important for us.
So like Sean, how I said about him before, how he's on the right side of history, I think that you're living life that is definitely truer than somebody who, you know, who say was like Alonzo, who is just like, oh yeah, I fell into this and this is just the way it is around here on the street. And it's like, but you don't have to be like that. And you had a point in your life where you could have said no.
Yeah.
And you didn't say no. And that has informed the entire rest of your life up until your death. You know, that's the kind of thing that determines it determines whether what the rest of your life is going to be after that, if you continue to give into that kind of thing, whether you're religious or or not. There's got to be a turning point.
And I think part of the reason why I link this so closely to the temptation of Christ is that when I saw this, I was 18 and I'd just gone to university. You're not going to get more temptation in life than going to university. You know, no one's going to make you go to lectures. No one's going to make you look after yourself or anything else like that. So that's where I experienced some of the greatest temptation I had in life, I think, you know, when it comes to all the kind of vices, when it comes to things that we talked about, like sex outside of marriage and stuff like that. It was really applicable at that time. It was a good experience because, yes, there are some things that you let go of. I never swore before going to university.
It's very surprising to me.
Yeah, and now I like to make the most of the vocabulary that has been given to me
I mean, I can't imagine a Giles that hasn't sworn before. But not that you swear all the time. Like, don't get me wrong, but it was just more of a case of like, you know, he didn't swear before. That's something.
But the things that I think were really important to me, they stayed. You know, they didn't go anywhere. Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. The last thing I wanted to talk about was the distinction between degree and category. I don't know if you remember, like, there's a scene in Luther. Luther is talking with Alice, and Alice. And this will just devolve into Idris Elba impersonations, you know. But they're talking about murder. They're talking about killing, and Alice gets Luther to admit that he would sort of kill in certain situations. And she says, "Okay, well, in that case, the distinction between you and me is one of degree, not of category." I want to draw your attention to one bit in the film. That's after Jake has saved that girl from being raped by the two junkies, and just as they're driving away, as they're talking about it, Alonzo is saying to Jake, "Oh, I see you got him in that chokehold, or they warned you about that in the academy," something like that, you know. And obviously chokehold being is prohibited for obvious reasons, you know. And then Jake saying, "Well, look, I was getting my ass kicked. What was I supposed to do?" So it shows you in that area there is one point where Jake is willing to bend the rules, and he is willing to break the rules under certain circumstances. So that tells us that the difference between Jake and Alonzo is one of degree, not of category. That makes sense. If he'd put somebody in a chokehold who's asthmatic or whatever and killed them, then he's killed them because he's a corrupt cop in the sense that he's willing to use, for want of a better phrase, illegal moves.
I think the thing is, though, is that he was put in a position where he thought, okay, I need to make sure I save this person. However, I also need to not die because I have like a wife.
Yeah. No,
like it was a matter of self-preservation rather than a matter of exerting power, which is what Alonzo would do.
Exactly. But this draws me onto the point that I wanted to talk about, is that for humans, our sense of being good or bad is one of degree. It's a case of how many good things have you done versus how many bad things have you done. Do the good things outweigh the bad things? But of course, the issue is that God doesn't work like that. With God, you are either pure or you're impure. You know, like if you have white paint and you put a drop of black paint in it, then it's
no longer pure.
Exactly. It's no longer pure white. It's now
a shade of grey.
Exactly, you know. And this is the thing a lot of people fundamentally struggle with, is that when you have a relationship with God, when you sort of come to God and you say, "I'm sorry for everything I've done, can you please forgive me?" And God is like tripping over himself to say yes, I forgive you. And then in God's eyes, you're completely pure again. Everything has been washed away, everything has been completely erased, and people might be able to remember what you did, but God can't remember what you did. That's something a lot of people outside of Christianity really struggle with, because you could see somebody who's been saved and you could say, yeah, but they did this and they did that and they did this and all these things, and you'd be like, yeah, but God doesn't see that anymore.
That is something that I struggle with. Like there are some people who I look at and I just go, I don't know if you're redeemable.
Yeah.
And I think it really does depend. I mean, like, there are some people out there who they're irredeemable in the respect that they can't change, that they can't ask for forgiveness because they believe what they're doing is completely correct.
Well, I'm gonna stop you. I'm gonna stop you at one point. I'm gonna remind you about the Apostle Paul and the Terminator.
Of course,
the only word I would say is that some people seem to be virtually irredeemable. they are practically irredeemable. They are so bad, so committed to things that it seems as if they'll never change. But I have to believe that every human being is capable of change, no matter how bad they are. I have to believe that no one is completely evil, no matter how appealing that idea is. Because if people were completely evil, it would be easy to just write them off. It would be easy to just say, well, they're bad, they're going straight to hell. All these things.
There are some people, I think, in the world who, I won't say are irredeemable, but are very evil people.
Yeah. So long as you add the words, the modifiers virtually or practically, or just something to suggest that you're not dealing with absolutes. Do you know what I mean?
Well, only a Sith deals in absolutes, so.
Yeah. And do you know what? I think we'd better leave it there, because I don't think we're going to do any better, you know?
I feel like that was the best way to end it, yeah. No, that seems great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for listening, guys. We've been a bit more rambly than usual, but honestly, I think this was exactly the thing I needed right now. If you like this episode, you might want to check out our BLM bonus episode, as it covers some similar subject matter to what we've talked about today. Phil, have you had a good time?
Oh, mate, I always have a good time when I'm doing these podcasts, but especially this one as well, just because it was a film that I never thought to watch before. Just because I saw it and I thought, well, yeah, it's probably good.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it's worth setting aside 2 hours. Turns out it totally was. I wish I'd watched it sooner, but I'm just glad I have now.
Part of the thing I enjoy is just showing people other films. I reckon we should do a podcast that's called I Can't Believe You Haven't Seen That Film I Think You Should Have Seen. And just
well, I'm down, man.
Awesome sauce. All right, listeners, thank you very much. We will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.
God in Film is hosted and created by Giles Goff and Phil Coleman. Mixing by Phil, editing by Giles. Our logo was designed by Julie Walsh, and our theme tune was composed by Rick Lee. Waffle editing by Natalie Austin. God in Film is a Dask production. Please rate and review, unless it's a 1-star, in which case, ring the phone number you hear when you play this episode backwards. After 3 tones, press the appropriate digit, 1 through 6. Each number corresponds to a bottle bank at a specific location, where you can dead drop your review, at which point Phil will ascertain the relative merits of your opinion and write it down in his feelings journal. Good luck.